Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Talking Points from the Sinica Network. I am Kaiser Guo, host of the Sinica podcast. I am joined, as always, by Eric Olander, host of the amazing China in Africa and China Global South podcasts. Hello, Eric. How are you?
Hello from Hawaii.
Oh, yeah, you are in Hawaii. And by Andrew Polk, who's the founding partner at strategic advisory firm Trivium China and host of their excellent podcast. The new one drops like right now. Hello, Andrew. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing good, Kaiser. Good to be here, as always. Good to see you guys.
Okay, Andrew, let's see if we can do something about that microphone weird sound that we're getting with you. But
all right,
yeah, it's kind of like, can you maybe just kill your earphones? That seems to be sometimes part of the problem.
Okay, yep. Let me see what I can do.
Those, just take those out. Anyway, Lizzie Lee could not join us this week. She's going to be a guest in heavy rotation going forward, but we are really going to miss her this week, and she's unfortunately unable to join. But tune in every 2 weeks for the three of us and Lizzie and sometimes other guests. Join us live so you can comment and so that you can throw your own questions into the mix. Let's begin today with major domestic news, which is, of course, a huge impact on China's relations with the rest of the world, on U.S. China relations, and especially on trade. China is now gearing up for its next 5-year plan, which will be the 15th 5-year plan, which covers 2026 to 2030. Already there is a lot of worry that this is going to be a new iteration of the infamous Made in China 2025, which, spooked the U.S. and a lot of other Chinese trade partners. Spooked them so badly, I think, that you could say that it marked the beginning of that first Trump trade war. It was the reason for the 301 inquiries and everything in investigations. But this time around, it was something a little less fanfare. Xi Jinping made a visit to a ball bearing factory in Henan province in central China. By the way, my ancestral province, for those of you wondering. This was the symbolic launch of 5-year plan season. Andrew, let's start with you. What was so significant about this visit, and what do you know? What do we know at this point about the outlines and the priorities for the 15th 5-year plan?
Well, hopefully my audio is a little bit better now.
It is.
Sounds
okay,
good.
Great. Yeah. So 15th 5-year plan, I mean, the big thing, obviously, that they're going to be focusing on is technology, right? Xi Jinping is all in on technological self-sufficiency. Everybody knows that by now. It's going to be more investing resources in making sure that the basic technologies that they need to compete in, over the next 5 years are going to be there. And that includes, you just had it on the headline, industrial upgrading, right? Technology, as the Chinese see it, is not just about cutting edge technology. It's about taking old industries and making sure that they are working more efficiently through, Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things, all of that connectivity that they think they can really boost some productivity. And that, I would say, is the final thing that ties it all together. We can debate about whether or not they're going to be able to achieve this, but they want more productivity-led growth over the next 5 years as well, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately,
quality productive forces, right?
Exactly, high quality productive forces. So it's technology, it's improving not only new industries, but upgrading old industries and focusing on productivity to the extent that you can. I think that's going to be really the thrust of it.
Right.
Andrew, how much of what we're going to see in this next 5-year plan is a response to what's going on right now with the U.S. and China, and how much of it is evolutionary from what she's been doing for the past 10 years in terms of dual circulation, comprehensive national power, rejuvenation, all of the, that work that he's been doing? Is this an evolution or is this a revolution?
That's a great question. As we always say, with China and in business, it's never either or, it's always both and, right? So, Xi Jinping's efforts to move China up the value chain, to have China invest in more cutting edge technologies and even basic technologies has really been one of the key themes of his, now 15-year tenure, or I guess, 15-year tenure. That's been in train for a long time. Xi Jinping has been on the record for many years saying the strongest economy is not the one that grows the fastest, but the one that has the best technology. But that, push has been further galvanized, of course, by what's happening with the U.S. And there's, I would not be shocked if they have even some elements of the 15th five-year plan that are more specifically about fighting back against the quote uncertain external environment, which is an oblique way to say fighting back against the U.S. trying to contain our technological rise.
Right, and we've got more galvanizing catalysts on the way for this.
Exactly right.
And we'll talk about that. Companies like Synopsys and what have you that are doing software design tools for semiconductor manufacturing. But let me ask you guys, given how disruptive Made in China was in back when it was launched in 2017-18, I mean, the packaging of it, it's kind of a handy shorthand name, given that it was just a very broad, very ambitious, and ultimately quite successful effort, right, to modernize. Given the fact that Beijing, I think, understands now, maybe too late, that trumpeting it so loudly like they did really brought the wrong kind of attention. I mean, like I said, the 301 investigations that launched the trade war. You'd think they want to be a little more low key about this, not all a fanfare. What do you think? Is this, first of all, is this a new iteration of Made in China 2025? I mean, some media outlets are already describing it as such. What's your sense of that? Eric, Andrew, what do you guys think?
I'll let Andrew go, but I'll I have some thoughts on it. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, there seems to be sort of a parallel effort, right, to not only put forward the five-year plan, but also to put forth a new version of Made in China 2025 over the next 5 or 10 years to see basically how they want to compete in various new technologies, what they'd call the new economy or new industries in the economy. So that's happening separately, sort of, and in parallel to the 15th five-year plan. I think they're absolutely going to try to replicate Made in China 2025 because they think that it was actually a total success, right? That it has really
they think, and I think, I mean,
yeah, no, 100%.
It was a success. There's no way to. I mean, you see what their lead is in automation. You see it, I mean, all that they set out in Made in China 2025 more or less has come to fruition.
Yeah, I've seen
I think they have a lot of confidence in saying that the next 5 years they're going to achieve it. But I guess, Andrew, the part that I'm most curious about is that depending on who you believe, 20 to 25% of college graduates in China today can get jobs. The majority of kids can't get jobs. How much of this is going to be focused?
The majority.
No, the majority of kids cannot. I mean, only about a quarter, but 1 out of 5 kids coming out of college today, or 1 out of 4 are getting jobs on graduation. I mean, the job market for young people in China is very, very tough. And I guess I'm curious about employment and how much of automation is going to eat. I mean, obviously there's a declining population, but there are some distortions in the employment market where they've got too many people at the higher end, not enough at the lower end in vocational. They're trying to address that. But how much of this focus on technology is going to be also a focus on employment?
I think there's a big question. There's a lot going on here. As we all know, employment's a huge issue for the party. Especially for young people worldwide, young people who don't have jobs can create problems for governments in all kinds of countries. I'm trying to
get my son to get a job. He's creating problems for me right now. He's young.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of what they're doing with the automation is really to replace jobs that are not going to be as abundant for older workers. So the problem is, you've got a shrinking population overall. You need some automation to, deal with the fact that overall you're going to have less workers. Then you have the additional problem, like you said, of distortions or imbalances, we'll say, in the labor market, where you have a lot of young people coming in to the economy, and they don't want to be working at a Foxconn factory. They don't want to be working in these, on these manufacturing floors, on these industry floors. So go ahead and having the party go ahead and automate those will continue to solve this problem of fewer and fewer people available and desiring to do those jobs. The problem is that they are not creating more sort of service sector, higher value jobs that young people do want to do. So the structure of the economy as it currently is, so heavily, dominated by manufacturing and investment, can't really accommodate these younger workers who want to do very different types of jobs. And so there's no easy solution. I mean, I think Chinese structural unemployment will be high, kind of for the foreseeable future until they can adjust basically the economy to provide more jobs that younger people want to do. So this is a reality they're going to face for a while. And I'd be interested in you guys I hear a lot of these young people kind of saying, coming out of college, I'm not sure where I fit into this economy right now because, the kinds of jobs I want aren't really available. The jobs in the tech sector are very sexy and in high demand, but obviously there's not enough of them to go around. And so I kind of feel like that plays into a little bit of the disillusionment among young people in China with a slower growing economy, fewer jobs available. And it's obviously something that is very concerning to the party, but that there's no immediate fix for.
Yeah, they can't all let's like start podcasts or write Substacks.
Exactly.
That's right. And to be fair, I mean, as you pointed out, this is not uniquely a Chinese phenomenon. I mean, I think we see this in Europe, we see this in the US, we see it in Japan as well, where young people are struggling to find a place in the economy. But I think one of the, Kaiser, I'd like to get your take on something, because one of the lessons that I've heard that she took away from the rise of Trump and the rise of populism in Europe is don't gut your industrial sector, because that will then lead to a populist backlash. Obviously, so amidst this push for high tech, he's also going to keep the industrial sector in order to make sure that employments are guaranteed to keep people from not being idled and then from not creating a populist backlash. Do you think those political calculations are factored into the 5-year plan as well?
Yeah, I think that they probably are. I mean, there's no doubt that they are. Not gutting the industrial sector, not hollowing out. That's a lesson that they've learned well. Of course, those jobs are not the ones that are going to be, it's not going to absorb a lot of the elite overproduction, and that's the problem. It's not that ordinary. I mean, people still talk about labor shortages in sort of low value add industrial work. The problem is elite overproduction. And this, I don't want to relate everything to my life raising teenage children or whatever, but it's like buying clothes for teenagers. It really is. It's like you cannot, you want to educate a large population. And if you look at the number of 18 to 22-year-olds enrolled in 4-year or greater programs, and how fast that has increased just in the last 20 years, it's astronomical. That was the right thing to do 20 years ago, to invest really heavily in higher education. I don't think there's any doubt. I think what they didn't anticipate is that the economy wouldn't grow into it to absorb that as quickly as they had planned. This is normal. I mean, this is going to be a dislocation for a while. It's going to be a problem, but I think they're going to, I think this is ultimately going to be good that they have a lot of skilled, highly educated urbanites, that 10 years from now, it's going to be a blessing. Right now, it's a big problem. It's a very, very big problem.
Hey, Kaiser, can I? Go ahead, Andrew.
I just wanted to add on, maybe push back a little bit on the premise of the question, Eric, in that I'm not 100% convinced that when I hear Xi Jinping talk about not wanting to hollow out the industrial sector, I don't hear him necessarily saying because we want to avoid a populist backlash, because we know people want those jobs. Like when you hear that in America, it's like you used to be able to have, a blue collar job at a auto factory that would allow you to buy a house and have a good life. And that kind of job doesn't exist anymore. When I hear China saying we don't want to hollow out our industrial sector, it's because we don't want to get in a situation like the U.S. and the West where we're reliant on other people to produce goods for us.
Right.
They want to be the ones that are producing goods for
which
themselves.
Is why there's we should have some sympathy for the Trump position in this sense. Again, Trump is very good at identifying problems, very bad at executing solutions. But the idea of outsourcing your entire pharmaceutical supply chain to another country doesn't always make a lot of sense. And so there is some validity to the complaint. And China certainly embodies that in what you're saying, Andrew.
I think, a couple of years ago, they were talking seriously about major educational reforms in China. I mean, I think this is still very much in the books, that they really want to train a whole generation of people who are skilled manufacturing managers, people who are, these are what they call sort of gold trimmed blue collar jobs, if they and these are jobs that are suitable for people who are graduate from universities. I a few years ago, a friend of mine, Mitch Presnick, you guys might have come across him. He was taking notes in preparation to interview me for something that we did together. And I said something about a tectonic shift, and he was writing in kind of sloppy cursive, and the C was kind of the first C in tectonic turned on its side. So when we were actually doing the thing, he said, "Kaiser, you've spoken about a teutonic shift in China." And I thought that was pretty funny because it was actually appropriate. I pivoted, I went with that, and I said, actually, I said tectonic, but I'm going to go with teutonic because they are trying to learn a lot from what they understand to be the German model, right? They really,
Hey, Kaiser,
want to have a more robust vocational educational system. They want to have a more robust, or they want a society in which people who work, are actually respected. Funny, I've heard of such a society. I think it was called communist or Marxist or something. But yeah,
hey,
that was the idea that
Kaiser, let me just remind you and everybody else that we're live right now on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on our YouTube channels, and we're getting some questions from folks. Let me put some of the comments to the panel here. Cannon Fodder, by the way, Cannon Fodder 43, he's one of our super fans at the China Global South Project.
Yeah, Cannon Fodder 43.
Cannon Fodder 43, who's one of the nicest commentators on, YouTube is not known for a lot of nice people who comment. And so I just want to give a big shout out to Cannon Fodder 43. But he says, it's things like this that make me wonder if they manage to stabilize and stop the population drop, or never did the one-child policy, that this elite overproduction would be worse. How much do you think the demographics factor into the 5-year plan, and in terms of trying to boost or reverse the population decline, which has not been successful by any measure over the past few years? Andrew, what do you think of what Cannon Fodder is saying there?
Well, it is a good point, and in a way, China's demographic situation is very unique in that it was brought on by the one-child policy, right? The one-child policy basically helped to balloon the working age population for a while. So it was a demographic dividend for a long time, and now it's become a demographic drag because now you have a whole generation of people who are, who are much older that make up the bulk of the population effectively. So you have fewer and fewer working age people to support the elderly and children. So that's the Chinese aspect, the very unique Chinese aspect of it. But having an aging population is an issue that a lot of countries face now and have faced. And if you look at the history of trying to sort of put forth pro-natalist policies to try to reverse that, every country fails because it's something that you sort of see coming 20 years out and you never act until it's upon you, right? Because it never seems like the most immediate thing from a policy standpoint. And that is exactly the trap that China fell into. And now it's already sort of too late. There's not a lot they can do to reverse the decline. They, try to incentivize people to have babies. They try to make it cheaper to have babies, things like that. But just, more women are working. It's very expensive now to have a family in many major cities in China. So there's just not a lot they can do. But to the broader point, the population changes are 100% going to be integral to the 15th 5-year plan. Like offsetting, basically, we talk about it, the 3Ds, and this big report that we've got coming out on China.
That's dirty, dull, and dangerous.
Yeah, it's demographics, debt, and deglobalization are the three overarching challenges that China will be facing over the next at least 5 years, probably more like 10 to 20. And all of the policies effectively will be designed to address those three challenges.
Demographic, debt, deglobalization. Okay.
We've gotten a little bit away from what I wanted to talk about, the 5-year plan, which is fine. I like these little, side roads for sure, in a little delving into demographics. But I want to get back to this. And first of all, before we really move on, what is a 5-year plan? I think there are a lot of people out there in the audience who are not necessarily clear on what it is, and who maybe are imagining the Soviet-style planned economy, that there were going to be production quotas for ceramic tiles or industrial presses or what have you. So, Andrew, when you talk to your clients, and explain what a 5-year plan is and how it works, what do you say?
So we tend to describe a 5-year plan like a State of the Union address in the U.S., but on steroids, right? It's a statement of policy intent that if anybody knows how the State of the Union is actually that sausage is made, everybody who's a speechwriter in the White House says it's the most terrible experience every single year, because every single person throughout the U.S. administration wants to get their policy priority put in for a 3-second, 3-minute shout out, in front of a global stage.
Right.
And so it's this big, mishmash of a bunch of different people's policy priorities, different institutions' policy priorities. And that's what I view the 15th 5-year or the 5-year plan as. A 5-year plan is, all parts of the government coming in to say, in this area, we want to do this. So I talked about technology and industrial upgrading, but there are social goals, there are environmental goals. I'm sure will be, goals for the auto sector, there's just all of this stuff. And so it's a statement of policy intent. There are some hard like quotas or targets to hit, for example, often in the environmental space, cleaning up the air or whatever. But those often the goals aren't very, specific. They aren't hard targets, and many of the targets are binding, many of them are not, and no one really knows. So it's kind of this overarching statement of intent, in my view. But it is, for the 5 years that the plan is active, kind of the baseline policy document that everything needs to tie back to. So it's also kind of an anchor that if you're designing policy in real time, in response to any development that may happen throughout those 5 years, you need to tie that policy development back to the initial goal of the 15th 5-year plan. So it's also a bit of a guidepost as well for policy over the coming 5 years.
Andrew, I've often talked about it in terms of two concepts. One is KPIs that this document sort of lays out the key performance indicators that will be in force at all levels of state, where cadres or administrators or people who run SOEs are sort of going to be measured against, right? And this sort of sets. And the other thing that I talk about are funko, these sort of areas where the prevailing winds will be blowing, right? And these are things that they're telegraphing to everyone. Here is where we will be clearing regulatory hurdles. Here is where we're going to provide some tailwind for you if you set sail here toward these goals. If you sail off toward these goals that we've laid out, you're going to do well. I mean, those waters are going to be awfully crowded with a lot of small craft, probably, but the waters will not be choppy, and they will take, they'll dredge and take out some of the reefs and shoals that might be in the way.
It's one of these things where when I was younger, I used to think that the 5-year plans was one of these stodgy communist things that, the Soviets did and, the Eastern Bloc. But, looking at, now running a business, my board requires me to do a 5-year strategic plan. It's typical in business we have to do it. And we talk about how Americans want Trump to run the government like a business, but yet we don't produce a similar type of vision that goes beyond a year. So you're right, Andrew. The State of the Union is strong. Here's what I want to do for the next year. But
what about Project 2025?
Well, and that's interesting because that was a plan and they are executing against it, no doubt.
Yeah,
but as a government,
sinister.
But as a government, we don't do that, and there is some wisdom, I think, in doing some kind of forward planning. We can't really do that in our system, though, because Trump can make a plan today, but he's going to cross into a new administration potentially in 28, and then that plan gets thrown out and a new one gets put in. So it's just our system doesn't really enable that kind of longer term thinking.
Right. I mean, and finally, before we really move on to our next topic, we're going to see a lot of continuity. This focus on, like you said, high quality development, technological innovation, the modernization of the industrial system. I don't know if you guys heard Arthur Krober when he did this appearance on Odd Lots, and he talked about something that I thought was really, really great, because the people are wondering about what are they going to do to increase consumption, And he sort of explained in a way that I haven't really heard before, that it was so well put. I have heard it before, but just never so put so articulately, about the logic behind the supply side consumption growth, and how, in Chinese thinking, it's not about just buying stuff, right? It's not just boosting the C component, the consumption component of GDP. It's also the stuff that shows up in the G component, government, and the I component in government spending, where, they build things that improve the livelihoods, the quality of life of people. And that's another sort of form of consumption as Chinese people understand it. And I thought it was really good. I heartily encourage people to listen to that Odd Lots podcast with Arthur on it. Let's move on. The biggest thing that happened since we spoke last, which I think was, shortly after Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer held their presser after the talks in Geneva and the so-called trade truce, actually had little to do with the trade conflict. That we will come back to that. I want to first talk about Premier Li Qiang's trip to Indonesia and to the big Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, plus ASEAN, plus China meeting in Malaysia. That was, as far as I can tell, it was just criminally underreported. I mean, it was reported, but just it wasn't given the level of attention, at least in, the U.S.-centric press. It wasn't like trending on Twitter, as it were.
No.
Eric, this is absolutely your wheelhouse, so please go to town and lead this discussion. I mean, you can start maybe with the new FTA, the free trade agreement between China and ASEAN.
So let's talk about first a couple of things. We'll talk about the FTA first. So they've completed the negotiations for the China-ASEAN FTA 3.0. And so this is an evolution of their free trade agreement that they've had. It's a complement to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that is already in place. So RCEP is a kind of a low tariff trade mechanism across Asia Pacific. And so what it shows you the urgency that the Chinese are placing on kind of expanding trade. And that was clearly a message that Li brought to Kuala Lumpur as part of his tour of Southeast Asia as well. And so, the summit in Kuala Lumpur was interesting. It was pretty light on substance, and a lot of really reputable China analysts, Jonathan Fulton, who's one of the top Gulf analysts out there, he said, listen, this was more about Malaysia trying to kind of build some momentum for its role as a player in this space. They talked about expanding trade in the context of the U.S. tariffs, and the U.S. tariff issue weighed heavily over this summit. And one of the things that I've been trying to have conversations, trying unsuccessfully to some extent, with a lot of folks here in the U.S. is to point out how just traumatic the tariffs are for countries in Southeast Asia. I mean, we're not out of the woods yet for Vietnam facing 46% tariffs, Cambodia 50%, Malaysia 34% tariffs. They're negotiating, but it's a threat that hangs over them. And so China's leaning into this. And by the way, Li was not the only head of state, and we'll talk about this later, but France's Emmanuel Macron was also in the region, also talking about tariffs and really benefiting from the unpopularity of what Donald Trump is doing in this part of the world.
Right. You stole my little pivot to our EU topic. Which
we'll get there. We'll get there very quickly, but I want to bring one soundbite for you. And this is something that wasn't covered at all in outside of Asia. And I want you guys to listen to it, and I want to get your reaction. This is before Li went to Kuala Lumpur. He made a stop in Jakarta and had a bilateral with Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto. And I want to play a soundbite from the Indonesia-China business reception.
Ingin menyampaikan rasa hormat saya kepada Republik Rakyat Tiongkok yang telah konsisten membela kepentingan negara-negara yang sedang membangun, the developing countries, konsisten melawan penindasan, melawan imperialisme, melawan kolonialisme, melawan apartheid. Republik Rakyat Tiongkok membela perjuangan-perjuangan pembebasan di negara-negara yang masih tertindas oleh imperialisme dan kolonialisme. Bukan pada saat sekarang, pada saat Tiongkok sudah kuat ekonominya. Waktu Tiongkok masih juga membangun, Tiongkok tetap membela perjuangan gerakan-gerakan pembebasan dimanapun. Dan sampai hari ini kita melihat kepemimpinan Tiongkok khususnya dalam membela rakyat Palestina sungguh membanggakan bagi kita semua.
So there are a number of things in that speech.
Well,
First of all,
let me just say, I feel like it's 70 years ago and we're in Bandung.
because no, but Kaiser, this is a really important point. Colonialism for many of these countries is not an ancient memory.
Right.
It is,
right.
and it is. I mean, listen, in our lifetime, we're all old enough that Vietnam was under foreign rule, and so we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the end of the war just earlier this month. This is very, very fresh. Now, a couple things stand out in this speech. First of all, Prabowo Subianto, is one of the key leaders in the global South. Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. It is the largest market in Southeast Asia. This is a pivotal player in the great power
Absolutely.
competition.
Yeah.
And for that kind of rhetoric coming from a leader at this moment in time when a lot of countries are trying to hedge and not kind of take a side between the U.S. and China, for him to come out that avowedly strong, aligned in China on such a deep spiritual way was very interesting. Now, a couple of things that he said that should draw your attention. The mention of apartheid. I thought that was very interesting at the very moment that the U.S. and South Africa are having, this fallout. And
I read that it's also about Gaza.
Well, okay, and then the endorsement, and again, this question of the Palestinians in Southeast Asia, particularly in a country like Indonesia, is just so important. And again, and third, this idea of the shared colonial trauma that both China and Indonesia have. And again, a lot of people don't appreciate in the global South that China itself was colonized by the same people that colonized them. And that is a touch point that you're seeing now come up a lot more in Chinese readouts and Chinese statements, that, the shared colonial history. And it's the us and them. It's us against them. And I thought Prabowo's statements there were very, very interesting. And it's the kind of rhetoric that I think here in the West, people are not anywhere near as attuned to as they should be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I had a conversation on one of our Trivium pods with my business partner, Trey, recently. And we talked about how, 10 years ago, I kind of saw these China-ASEAN meetings, the China-Africa FOCAC meetings as sort of, a sideshow that really didn't move the needle geopolitically. But China has invested in these forums and these relationships for 20, 30 years, and
they've
now
been consistent too. They've been consistent.
And now they do move the needle, because those countries are talking about which side of this are we going to be on? Can we try to split down the middle, and play both sides? The Singaporean prime minister, I think, just said, it's becoming harder and harder to stay neutral. And so those kinds of conversations bilaterally between China and Southeast Asian neighbors, multilaterally between China and ASEAN, and then China, ASEAN, and the GCC, those blocks, for lack of a better word, are just carrying so much more weight in this fracturing global economy and sort of this fracturing geopolitical environment. So
Eric, let me ask you about something. What Andrew just said, it prompted a question of mine. You've often in the past, in recent years even, talked about BRICS as nothing but basically a forum for a shared grievance against the United States. And I wonder whether you're seeing BRICS now becoming something more substantive than just that forum to air, anti-American
Now,
grievances.
don't get me wrong. I actually think a forum for grievance is substance. I mean, we live in
Okay.
an era where grievance-based
But you have
politics
sort
is-
of disparaged the importance of
No,
BRICS as
I
an
just see
organization.
that in the past decade plus that BRICS has been around, it hasn't produced a lot in the way of tangible policy or trade mechanisms or there's been lots of incremental small things. So we now have BRICS TV, we now have BRICS industrial parks exchanges, we have there's these exchanges in the chemistry sector among BRICS countries. It is becoming a more important convening forum. And one of the most important part of BRICS is that ability for, say, Prabhu now, who can have a conversation with Iran. Prabhu would find it very difficult to have a bilateral conversation with Iran or even to some extent Russia without attracting the ire of other partners. But in a BRICS context, he can do that. That is a very meaningful contribution to be able to have these developing countries to be able to have conversations in this kind of setting. That being said, we're not going to see a BRICS currency. We're not going to see there is a BRICS payment system that's coming, but it's never going to have a monetary policy because the largest member of BRICS is China, and India, for example, would never want to surrender any of its monetary sovereignty to China.
Well, and just because, I think we can sort of keep our expectations, man, just because the BRICS, group is not going to create a common currency doesn't mean that the forum, as you say, isn't becoming more important. And I would agree in that 10 years ago. I mean, let's not forget BRICS was created by, Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs as an investment thesis, right? So it never really made any.
And he hates the group, by the way. He has nothing nice to say about it.
But if you compare kind of even just the reporting on the BRICS meetings versus the reporting and attention paid to, say, the G20, I would say BRICS is clearly on a sort of ascendant path, and sort of legacy forums like the G20, they're becoming more and more feckless with no actual outcomes because you can't get developing countries to agree with developed countries on anything.
And it's the same with the G7, which looks increasingly like a relic of a time gone by, of a bunch of white countries getting together to kind of proclaim some type of proclamation. And S. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister of India, he made a very interesting point about not only the BRICS, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that India is also a part of. He said, listen, we tried to get into the G7 and to be able to get into some of these exclusive clubs, and they wouldn't let us in. So we made our own. And I think that's an interesting take on this, where these big countries feel marginalized in the old institutions. So India does not have a voice on the UN Security Council, and it feels that it should. It never will, because China will always veto any reform of the UN Security Council that could potentially allow Japan or India to have a seat there. But they feel that the old structures do not fit their needs, so they're building new ones. The United States clearly looks at that as a threat to its hegemonic power, and that's why they denigrate the BRICS. But I think they do that at their peril, because again, I'm not quite as negative as Jim O'Neill is. I think it's still more of a convening for grievance, but grievance is important today in politics. Very,
Absolutely.
very important. And I think that is something that can't be overstated.
Well, Eric, as you said, Li Qiang was not the only person who had been traveling in Southeast Asia in recent weeks. You mentioned Emmanuel Macron. He'd also been there. You've been watching that. Why don't you start us off and talk a little bit about what Macron was doing in Southeast Asia? What are some of the things that came out of his meetings there?
So Macron came to, he first started his trip in Vietnam, and that caused a little bit of a scandal. I forgot to bring the video up. I don't know if you guys saw this or not, but the door was opening for him to get off the plane in Hanoi, you see this hand just kind of slap him in the face. His wife apparently just whacked him upside the head. So that dominated a lot of the press coverage, particularly in the French media, for at least the Vietnam portion of the trip. He then heads down to, he went down to Indonesia, and then he went to Singapore, and he's at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore right now. But one of the things that he's been talking about is trying to make space for France in particular, but Europe more broadly, in this, what he's calling a new coalition, and trying to position Europe, which has been in many ways marginalized by Trump, in the new great power competition dynamic, because Trump kind of sees the world as China, the US, and Russia, with no role for Europe. And so Macron here, as one of the, really the core members of Europe in the Franco-German kind of axis, that sits at the foundation of the European coalition, is trying to kind of revive this idea of Europe becoming irrelevant in the Indo-Pacific and in Asia-Pacific. So that's been his message, is to expand trade. Now, that was very warmly received in Vietnam. Let's not forget that Vietnam has a free trade agreement with Europe. And one of the strategies that a lot of countries are seeing is they want to reduce their exposure into the US market so that they are not ever again this vulnerable to where they are today, to the kinds of tariffs that are being hung over their head. And so there is a lot of enthusiasm right now to lean more into ASEAN-European ties. And I think Macron found a very, very willing audience when he kind of brought this idea of a new coalition.
Yeah, absolutely. So unless we have more to say about that, let's move to to Europe itself. There's been a real flurry of EU and China activity ahead of the July EU meetings that are going to take place in China. We had Xi and Macron meeting, Xi and Merz, Minister of Science and Technology, Chinese Minister of Science and Technology, who most visited Denmark. The EU also has passed some legislation that is really, really irksome to China on Chinese parcels, sort of like the removal of the de minimis exception in the United States. They've pushed back the deadline for the tariffs to July for more negotiations, but they're also considering adding additional tariffs on China as part of the deal, and then China is absolutely not happy about that. We also had Czechia alleging that their Ministry of Foreign Affairs was being hacked by Chinese, whether successfully or not.
Czechia, for those at home who aren't following along, is also Czech. The old Czech.
Right?
That's right.
It's now Czechia. And on this program, we say Turkey and we say Czechia. So just because we call things the way that people want to be called. So, but Kaja Kallas responded, saying that they would impose costs on Beijing over this alleged spying scandal. So where are we right now? As July comes up and the visits come up, where are things? They are very much in motion right now in Europe. Andrew, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very fragile, right? There's a lot of talking going on. The Chinese are, trying to have as many conversations with various EU member countries as they can, at as high of a level as they can, and very much try to play the moment against the United States, right? And say, listen, we talked about this before. You're the stable trading part, or we're the stable trading partner. You don't know what is going to happen with the US. And yet there are still all kinds of sticking points, right? There's, just not really political will in Europe to pivot towards China. I think to the extent there's positivity, the Europeans don't want to fight a two-front trade war. So at least they're willing to sort of put the trade war with China, I think, or the trade tensions with China on hold. But that doesn't mean they want to throw in their lot with China per se. And then meanwhile, all these, kind of small nitpicks, wrong word, but these small jabs with the, small parcels being from China being, having a surcharge, making it more difficult for Shein and Temu to ship their goods over there. Those kinds of issues continue to bubble up. So I think the Europeans, my sense is they're interested in continuing a dialogue with China. They do not want to be fighting a two-front trade war with China, but they're still kind of open to all options. And the reporting is that part of the US-EU negotiations may be that the EU takes a tougher line with China. So if they can turn down their trade war with the US and turn up their trade war with China, that may be an option they pursue, because at least then they're still not fighting a two-front trade war. I think it's very delicate right now. And
Eric?
you see a bunch of different things cutting against each other.
you have to look at it sometimes on two different levels. There's the EU engagement with China, which oftentimes is more contentious. Ursula von der Leyen for a long time has taken a much tougher line, and she's brought in issues on human rights, and she's brought issues obviously on trade. And then you see the bilaterals. And when Macron, and we just had the Spanish Prime Minister earlier this year do a tour, Merz is gone to China, there's a very different type of conversation that happens. And that's what makes this particularly confusing, because the interest of German industry right now is they need the volumes that they get in China to sustain. They have to keep those up. So BMW has been, investing more to compete in the Chinese EV auto market. Audi is investing more into the Chinese auto market. And at the same time, they've had these flirtations with Chinese autos where they put tariffs, but the tariffs weren't insurmountable like they are in the United States. So I was just in Austria, and there's some Chinese cars on the road. I mean, they're there, but they're not a lot. But they're also worried that if they let the flow of Chinese cars in, that could potentially gut their entire auto industry. And so they're in this very difficult kind of space where they have to contend both with the EU relationship and on the bilateral level. But I encourage people to look at those two tracks separately, because they oftentimes have very different tones to them.
Well, and I would add, even at the EU level, they've been pulling their punches a little bit. Van der Leyen has toned down the rhetoric towards China since the U.S. trade war started. And so totally agree that these are two separate tracks. And it's, a truism of past since the EU became a union that, wrangling all those cats into one, unified position has never made sense, or is always difficult to do. Not that it never made sense, but it's always difficult to do. But, interestingly, I will just say the Europeans, they're approaching their trade policy, their tariff policy, with an actual outcome in mind. It's not that they don't necessarily want Chinese cars. They just want those Chinese cars to be produced in European countries if it's going to happen, so that they can still provide jobs and GDP and investment and all those stuff. So they put on tariffs to make it more difficult or more expensive to export from China to Europe. But that then incentivizes over time more Chinese production inside of Europe. Now, this is where the interesting piece on the bilaterals starts to come into play. China is very much investing in, obviously, Hungary, Italy, Spain, the countries that are more forward leaning in terms of, let's try to find a productive relationship with China. Whereas the French and the Germans and some others, there's less investment there from China, because they know that they're taking the lead, often with Macron being a little bit of an outlier case for now, but often those countries are the ones leading the charge on, we need to be tougher against China.
Andrew, whatever it was that you did last time to fix your audio, I think you need to do it again. Meanwhile,
the back.
I want to say, so we've talked about just now, Andrew was talking about the European activity, Chinese activity in Europe. Our mutual friend, Jens Eskerlund, the European Chamber, he heads the European Chamber. They've just released their report on economic confidence in European companies operating in China, and it's at sort of record lows. This is primarily not even just the tariffs; it's the general slowdown of the Chinese economy. They may perhaps being over pessimistic, but Jens had a comment in the FT where he was saying, well, basically they're caught on the horns of a dilemma. They're very much dependent on they're going to be there no matter what. I mean, they need China in their supply chain, as Eric was just saying. The German companies, they absolutely need to be in China, but they're fading. I understand. Actually, we're both going to be meeting with Jens in the near future, right? In Beijing, right, Andrew? So I don't know what's your sense. Are they being overly pessimistic right now, or what's driving the negativity among European companies operating in China?
Well, my sense, and yes, I will be meeting with Jens and the UCCC. Not sure if I got the audio back. Hopefully,
Yeah,
you do. Good. Yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with this. Anyway, we'll be seeing them. My impression from the reporting around the latest survey was, I mean, primarily it's that China's economy still is not doing well, right? And European companies are like, we're just not making the money that we used to. Everyone, obviously, for decades and decades was used to making, just all rising tide lifts all boats. And then you combine that with the fact that Chinese companies are becoming more and more and more competitive. So you've got a slower growing pie, and Chinese companies, especially as we all know in the auto sector, are taking more and more of that pie. And I think that European companies are frustrated because it's just much harder to eke growth, let alone profit, out of that market right now. Then you throw on top of that the the tariff. So if you're bringing in goods from the U.S. as a European manufacturer in China, then you're getting whacked with tariffs. If you're exporting anything to the U.S., you're getting whacked with tariffs. And on top of that as well, the Europeans they're becoming collateral damage often between the U.S. and China, with the most specific example being the rare earth export controls, which the Chinese put on as part of the U.S. China back and forth. But they put on the controls for all countries, and then they were just not going to provide licenses for exports of rare earths to the U.S. And they were going to provide.
Looks like they're backing down in with Europe on this.
They are, but the problem is they weren't really prepared, and so the licenses are coming through very slowly. No one really knows the process. The MOFCOM bureau that's responsible for granting licenses is super understaffed. So the Europeans are collateral damage insofar as, even though the Chinese are saying to them, "Don't worry, we'll get you this stuff," no one knows when, because the bureaucratic systems for this are slowing everything down. And so I think you just throw all that together, and it's tough to be a European business in China right now.
Hey, just so we can try to wrap it in an hour, I do want to move on to a next topic, even though there's lots more to say about Europe, and we will revisit this, obviously, and we'll be focused on this in July during the actual visits, of course. But let's talk a little bit on this. Just this morning, it looks like the trade war is back on. The truce, however fragile or even non-existent it might have been, is done with. I'm curious what you guys think went wrong. I mean, is this was all? My personal theory is all this the memification of the taco trade. Trump always chickens out. Really got under his skin, and he decided I'm gonna stick it to China again, show them that I'm no chicken.
I mean, this was ordained to happen. I mean, we saw this happen in the first Trump administration after the second round of the trade. Remember, his second trade deal never materialized, where the Chinese made all sorts of promises and it never just got off the ground. And there was
this little thing called COVID that happened.
Fair enough, but this was ordained to happen. I mean, there's no way that this was going to be a quick fix for as quick as Trump wants it to be done. And you can just I think the taco thing definitely played a role. There was a funny meme that came on, is that journalist cost, I think, about the global economy, something like $10 trillion with their comment. And but nonetheless, I think that did get under his skin, and it's hard to imagine that. Well, he probably would have written something like this with or without the taco comment. But taco, just for those of you not following at home, is Trump always chickens out. And that's apparently what brokers were saying about him. And so he got really pissed off with that, But it just seemed to me that this was inevitable, that the two sides would not come to terms. And the politics are not, kind of set up for concession and compromise.
And the taco trade is where you basically buy the inevitable dip that comes after Trump makes some belligerent threats, on the assumption that he's going to chicken out. He's going to, and that the markets will rebound.
Yeah, people are getting rich off of those dips.
Yeah, I mean, no, it seems pretty disingenuous, though, of the administration to be saying that it was China that broke faith and violated the truce. I mean, at least from where I sit, I mean, the U.S. side, even before the ink was dry on the statement, was making Huawei Ascend chips anathema globally as part of the revocation of the what's it called, the AI diffusion rule, right? From the Biden administration. The U.S. side was rolling out even more onerous tech export restrictions. I mean, this was a few days ago, but trying to cripple China's ability to use design software from Cadence or Synopsys or
and the plane parts for the C-19
and plane parts for Comac, right, for the C-19. And then, of course, then there has been this whole spate Trumpian petulance, which I think sits at the intersection of his war on elite institutions and his ire toward China, right? And we can get into that in a little bit, but yeah, all sorts of reasons why. But what, Andrew, is your understanding, or Eric, is your understanding of what it is that China somehow failed to do in Trump's mind? What did they not do to dishonor the terms of Geneva?
Well, I mean, I'm with you. I think, taking Trump's, social media post, you always wondered, is this really reflective of policy or whatever? The Chinese
Let's pull that shit off the screen right now. I mean, I'm tired of looking at it.
You can't take it anymore.
Thank you.
I wanted everybody to read it carefully.
Right.
The Chinese were, always going to be blamed for backing out, I think. And I think this thing was set up to fail. It was always super fragile.
That's it.
On the U.S. side, so first of all, there's definitely a debate and contention within the White House as to whether we really want to deal with China or not, and what that deal is about. Inside the White House, there's a thinking that they can break apart the tariffs issue from the tech and export control issue. Oh, we can be negotiating on tariffs and trade, but meanwhile, we can be hitting them and keeping them from, advancing technologically. And those two issues somehow are separate. Chinese do not see those as separate at all. In fact, they made their export restrictions a part of their response to the U.S. tariffs to specifically build some leverage in that area. So
Right.
my guess is the narrative on the U.S. side is around those export controls on rare earths.
Yeah.
That was one of the big things that brought the U.S. side to the table. They were really worried about those rare earth export controls. And my guess is we're now 2.5 weeks in from the agreement, and there have been no licenses provided for U.S. buyers of those rare earth magnets, because it's, like I already talked about, it's so slow, the licensing process.
Right.
And so I can see how the Trump administration has built up a narrative saying, well, they haven't done the licenses like they said they were going to do. And so they're not keeping their part of the bargain. And that's my guess of what has gotten up to Trump by people who want the deal not to succeed.
And they reached for it faster because of Taco, right, Eric?
Yeah. But Andrew, help us understand a little bit of the politics in Washington right now that are guiding some of the China policies. So you've got the Peter Navarro nativist faction. You're starting to see some grumblings on Capitol Hill about the concerns of store shelves being empty, only $2 for Christmas. This is rhetoric that Congress doesn't like, because it's coming up in the town hall meetings. You've also got the voice of Elon Musk now back in private industry, but Musk is worried about rare earth, and he's worried about some of those the supply chains coming in for Tesla and for his robotics side. These are the different inputs coming into the White House. Which of the factions right now do you think has the upper hand? We're not seeing as much of Navarro in leading the narrative. Bessent is clearly in charge, but what faction does Bessent represent in all of that? Is that a Wall Street faction? Is it, because again, there's a little bit of Game of Thrones going on here in terms of who has the president's ear on China, and it changes,
Right. Where does Rubio sit in this too? I mean, given
That's true.
He just made this announcement, the State Department just changed the policy. They're going to be aggressively revoking visas of Chinese students who have quote unquote connections to the Chinese Communist Party. Or
I thought you were going somewhere else, Kaiser, because just last week they gutted the big parts of the National Security Council.
Yeah,
they got rid of the China. They got rid of the China team.
Right.
So
I'd be curious what you guys think, what to make of that, because I can't read that, Andrew. So a lot of questions to you.
Yeah,
and this will take us to the hour, but let's see what you have to say.
Yeah, let me see how much sense I can make of this. I think there's a lot of chaos. And so really kind of understanding exactly what's happening and who's up or who's down at any given moment is difficult to do. I'm not sure it totally makes sense, frankly, to talk about factions and who's kind of has more or less influence with Trump. To the extent that there are factions, Bessent is definitely, he wants to lower the temperature on the trade piece, but still have some amount of tariffs on China and get some concessions, structural concessions from China. Now, he said, I think overnight, he was on Fox News and he said, things are kind of breaking down. We may need Xi Jinping and Donald Trump to step in. And we've gone over many times why that's very unlikely to happen, because Xi Jinping doesn't want to negotiate directly with Donald Trump. But the point that I'm trying to make when it comes to, I'm not sure it makes sense to talk about factions, is every meeting I have in DC, especially with anyone who's anywhere near the government, says it all comes down to just what Donald Trump decides in the moment. And I don't know, it's not like the last administration where there are people angling this way and that, and he's kind of getting pulled. I think it may be like the last person he talked to. It may be, but my impression is it's very much shooting from the hip. What do I think today about the China negotiations and specifically tariffs? So I won't go on too much longer, but the other piece of this, I think, is that Donald Trump cares about the tariffs a lot. Like, it's his one consistent policy issue. That's the thing. He's letting Besant take the lead, but he's the decider. That's the thing he's most interested in. I think everybody else is kind of trying to take their little piece of the China pie and run with it as far as they can, to either sort of impress Donald Trump or to just be ignored by Donald Trump while they pursue their, pet project or, signature goal or whatever it is. So on export controls, I think Letnick's doing his thing because Donald Trump is not in the weeds on export controls.
Right.
We know he's not a details guy. So Commerce is moving that forward on their own. The only question in my mind is, are they doing it to kind of like get the attention of the big man and say, look at us, be proud of us? Or is it, don't look at us and we just want to push forward a policy agenda while you're ignored? Same with Rubio at State. I think it's one of those two answers. It's either Rubio trying to get a gold star from,
or it's him believing in this stuff and knowing that Trump's not really going to be interested one way or the other.
Right.
Either way, you end up in this place where very hawkish individuals are pushing forward policies that are undermining the more central goal of trying to find some kind of lasting agreement with China.
Well, I have this terrible habit of trying to, my mind just does this habitually, of trying to impose order on what is in fact a completely random, chaotic system. And when as Andrew says, he's shooting from the hip. Well, we've been shooting from the hip from the last hour, and hopefully our remarks have been a little more coherent, a little more sensible than the ones that emanate from Pennsylvania Avenue. But thank you all for joining us, those of you who are joining us live, and I hope that we will have a lot to talk about when we convene again in 2 weeks. So, Eric, great to see you. Thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy your last day in Hawaii. And Andrew, as always, great to see you. Check out the podcast that drops today. It's going to be like Kendra Schaefer week on the Sinica network, because Kendra's on not only Trivium Pod, but she's got a fantastic interview on Sinica that will drop this coming Wednesday. So thanks very much.
Bye, guys.
Take care.